Welcome to Reaction, this edition of Rapid Reaction with me, Iain Martin. I'm joined by my colleague, Maggie Pagano. Maggie, we're going to talk a bit today about the budget. We're talking 48 hours or so since Rishi Sunak unveiled tax and spending measures in the UK. A very big deal, big financial event, huge amount of media coverage. What did you make of it?
After listening to it for 50 minutes, an hour, I thought I never, ever want to hear another budget again. And I also thought that we need to reform our budget system. It seems to me that it is the most inefficient way of running a country's finances. The way it had become, it seemed to me, we'll talk about the big numbers and where it went in a minute, but a lot of fiddling, a lot more paperwork. We've got 171 pages of tax already. It's just we're overcomplicating everything. And the first rule of oligopoly is that people will continue doing so. And we need to break the stranglehold. So that's my sort of rant. And I'm sure you agree. It's just, it's more work for the tax accountants. We know the very rich will be able to pay the tax accountants to make sure they don't pay so much tax. And the middle Britain is going to be squeezed to the pips. So the big number really was the money going on health, now 44%, I think, of total spending. Now, spending on health can be infinite, and the big numbers sort of almost irrelevant. My worry is that what we need desperately in Britain is supposedly more doctors, nurses, hands-on, and reforming what these people do. My fear is when you get more money just being plugged in, it's just going to go into management. I'm wary of using the word reform because everyone will go, oh God, you want to break it up. I'm not talking that. There's obviously a lot of work that needs to be done within the NHS. So that's one comment. I think freezing personal allowances for the next 4 years, which will bring the revenue a lot of money actually in real terms.
It's a huge tax hike.
It's huge, 121% or something. Very big tax hike at a time of rising prices and inflation. And as we saw, mortgage rates already nibbling up. Yeah. So it's going to be a very tough time for a lot of those in a middle income earning from 22 to 70, 80, who are just about managing. I was about to use that terrible expression.
Like you, I don't really like budgets. I don't think it's a very sensible way to construct national policy. I also really dislike the political hoopla around it, and in the hours that follow, Tory loyalists or Labour loyalists under Brown's stewardship saying, well, it's absolutely marvelous, brilliant, cheer to the rafters, and actually budgets don't always fall apart, but you only really discover the real story. It used to be you discover the real story in the Sunday papers, and that's now now sped up by social media and people in certain think tanks like the IFS and the Resolution Foundations digging through stuff in real time and then announcing hours later where the tax hikes really are and where the burden really falls. The thing that concerns me most about it, I mean, obviously with my instincts on these things, I'm deeply concerned about the state becoming this big, deeply concerned that we are, as you described, spending that much money on health, which is Rupert Harrison, who's former chief of staff to George Osborne, and now in the city, and always worth listening to. I mean, he made the fair point on the NHS that this is a product of democratic choices and the government following essentially public opinion. It's what the voters that the Tories feel that they need to win or to win again. That's what they want. Ever larger sums of spending on the NHS. To which I'd say, well, I take that. I can see the political logic for it, but not necessarily the economic sense, and not when it seems to be impossible to have a serious discussion about reform. I disagree with you slightly on the management point, and I think maybe the NHS is a massive organisation. It needs proper management, but how can that
Work
how
better.
can that money, how can that resource be made to work, to go further? Which is, in the early 2000s, the Blair government had some success, considerable success, with the agreements that were constructed on bringing in the private sector, which horror, that means bringing in private institutions who might make a profit, but using their excess capacity and expertise to manage down the waiting list. So that was a success. But I suppose my bigger concern is about just how confused and confusing it all is in terms of the signals it sends about where Britain is going. Because there was that little section at the end where Rishi Sunak said, look, I'm a small state person, really. I'm a pro-market person. The state, there are dangers in the state having become too big. But he was then criticizing essentially his own budget. And the logic seems to be that, well, he'll run the economy because Boris wants to run it. He'll run the state like this, hot for the next couple of years, spending huge amounts of money, and that will then create scope for tax cuts at some point before the next election. But that all seems to me far too tricksy. What Britain needs now is needs a really clear story about innovation and growth and investment. And I don't know about you, Maggie, but conversations I have with people, I've had 2 conversations this week with serious people who are invested in the UK and just looking at the British political situation, slightly freaked out by the aftermath of Brexit, but just getting all these contradictory signals from government. Yep. On the one hand, saying Britain has this great kind of technological future, life sciences, pro-entrepreneurship. And then on the other hand, taxes are going through the roof effectively, and the unreformed state is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Well, they can't both be true. And really can't both be true. So I just think the signal it sends is, it doesn't say come to Britain, which is post-Brexit, really setting about becoming competitive on taxation, high growth economy, serious about tackling its productivity issues, really interested in automation, really interested in modernization. It says high tax. It says high tax and potentially even low growth as well when you track through the figures.
I mean, even worse than those who want to invest in Britain is surely those who live in Britain and want to start their own businesses. There was nothing there to invite anybody to want to go and risk their own capital. And I'm very disappointed in Sunak. I mean, we know there's always a tension between a prime minister and a chancellor, that 'twas ever thus and has been for the last 40 years. And I don't expect him to have resigned, but that last little bit was sort of, saying to the hangman, honestly, I'm innocent, Gov, it was a bit pathetic, really. And it is just not credible that over the next 2 years they'll cut taxes. I mean, that's just nonsense. Not when they've frozen allowances, which is basically a tax hike over that period. So really, really disappointed. Lots of fiddling, lots of gimmicks, as you say, messed around with the apprenticeship levy. We do need more skills. We need more incentives for innovation, which we do brilliantly, as we both talked about before, life sciences, AI, fintech. We got fantastic skills, knowledge base, and we need to improve it. And there was nothing there that would make anybody want to set up their own business or to risk their capital. That's so disappointing.
The other observation I would make would be about the numbers and the data. Quite a lot of argument on, well, there's always argument on Twitter, but in the political and media classes, quite a lot of argument around the OBR,
the 6.5
numbers, and what do they mean? Look at the estimates they're making on how Brexit has hit exports and the impact it's had on GDP. The OBR's then making some fairly heroic assumptions, as the Bank of England is, I think, on inflation, which will just sort of magically return somewhere closer to target at some point in late 2022 or early 23. And I got into discussion with various people about this, and I think I'm not trying to be too apocalyptic about it. I'm not saying that there's some massive economic explosion coming, but if you look at the way in which the data or the projections has been so wrong since, well, I was going to say since early this year, but it even goes back to the start of the crisis as well, is that I can understand why the authorities have to do it and have to attach numbers to things, because people have become, post-Gordon Brown, obsessed with modeling and what does next year look like and the year after look like, which actually is not really how chancellors used to present these things, because the answer is you don't know. But particularly after a pandemic and after the disruption of Brexit, and people are saying, well, look, the OBR says this is minus 2.6%, and that'll be 1.4%, and it is. I'm sorry to break it to people, almost completely bogus. It carries about as much credibility as the credibility of one of the major banks saying in the spring of 2007, we are not exposed to subprime at all, and we're very confident about growth for 2008, 2009. There are so many variables here in terms of global trade patterns, and also the number that needs to be done on central banks and the aftermath of QE, which, as I have to say, a former finance minister said to me this week at a party, I don't understand it, and I don't think the Bank of England fully understand how you, having done QE, how you unwind it and what effects that will then have on the economy. I stress again, hopefully it'll be okay. But all of this stuff that we've seen written about, next year will look like X, and then the following year there'll be tax cuts, and then there'll be a massive push towards an election, and the Tories will probably win a majority, and you can map these things out. It's just absolute nonsense.
That's very optimistic. And if they do put up interest rates, and we see people in this middle who, I mean, you and I have lived through 15% interest rates jacking up, but this younger generation, if their mortgage payments start doubling, and there's no and taxes being squeezed, you're going to have real problems. Plus, we haven't talked about the corporation tax going up from 19 to 25%. I mean, it's not often I agree with Danny Blanchflower, but if we see interest rates go, I can see us being tipped into recession actually. Whereas it's
not implausible. I mean, it is. If you, we talked about this, didn't we? I think last week, Maggie. If you the bets that traders are making on rates and the authorities' policies is essentially that they think rates are going to rise, probably a bit faster than people think, and then they'll have to be cut because the combined impact of increased interest rates was actually not really, it's not going to be a huge amount involved, but still just that upward pressure. And who really knows how temporary the inflation thing is? That combined with the tax increases does not suggest huge consumer confidence or investor confidence in 6 months or a year's time. So you could get some kind of downturn, at which point they then have to cut rates again. So the whole scenario is very confused, subject to external shocks. And I think I just think a lot of the coverage this week took for granted was based on assuming that the numbers which the government and the OBR and the government have built their models on are correct. I mean, who the hell knows? I just wanted to ask you, final question, Maggie, about Labour, which obviously is the other side of this, is if there is further economic dislocation, then surely that should be theoretically good for the Labour opposition. How did they do this week in terms of responding? And it wasn't Starmer.
Yeah, no, it wasn't Starmer. And that's my other really argument with the budget. It's such a set piece. The opposition has to stand up and criticize it. They have a pat piece. They can't really get to it. There's no real debate. These are issues of national importance, and almost some of them should be cross-party, but that's another. No, I thought Rachel Reeves did very well. I mean, there is a wonderful irony here. If Starmer and Rachel Reeves could pick up, if you like, the pick up the small business
Yeah.
enterprise vote, talk to them directly. They had an idea on business rates. I don't necessarily agree with that, but if they could just wake up and see that they do talk to, I mean, I hate the expression, but the ordinary man in the street who is actually quite entrepreneurial. Most people would have something on the side and want to do. If they could speak to that, the Conservative Prime Minister who Keynesian, and then.
But then they're economically they're inhibited from doing that by ideology, aren't they? I mean, there's really. I agree with you. I thought Rachel Reeves was from a theatrical point of view, and also having to do it late. It was only I think 15 minutes before PMQs that she knew that Starmer couldn't couldn't be there because of COVID related reasons. So the performance was impressive. Also, I think I would highlight Bridget Phillipson, who's the shadow chief secretary to the Treasury, and I'm probably not doing her any favors here, particularly considering how left the Labour Party is. That it just reminded me a bit of the early, the early Blair and Brown performances when you saw them. When Kinnock was leader, and then under John Smith, you can see there are signs of life. In the Labour Party, and Phillipson, I think, is someone to watch. But they can't really turn around and say, look, the government's spending too much money.
No, but they can say spending it in the wrong way. Possibly,
but wasn't it essentially a Labour budget, which is that's what the politics of it are. It is trying to defend that Tory 80-seat majority and maybe even increase it in a few years' time.
Well, in a way, that's what the Tories want you to think, isn't it? Because they want to annihilate, if you like, the opposition. But if Labour are a bit clever, sit down, dissect this, they say, great, the spending is very good, but actually we need to be doing it like this, and we need to be doing more for enterprise and small businesses, and look at tax rates, simplification. They can steal their clothes. Maybe we can have a trade-off between the two parties.
Yeah, well, we'll see.
Or a new political party, Iain.
Never works.
I know it doesn't. Does it? Or just a little bit.
I think Chuka Umunna tried that with limited success.
But I'd like to see a little bit more dissent on the Tory benches, wouldn't you? I mean,
I think it's kind of pathetic at the moment. Yes, there is. I mean, there are a few people speaking out. I think people are just a bit stunned after the pandemic, also not sure how the politics of all of this is going to develop, worried about the smarter ones, worried about what lies ahead in terms of the economy for the next 6 months for a year. But yes, I agree with you that it's I think people are just a bit stunned and a bit beaten down, but we'll see. So on that basis, I think we'll wrap that up for now. You've been watching Reaction with me, Iain Martin, editor of Reaction, and my colleague Maggie Pagano. If you're not a subscriber to Reaction on YouTube, hit the subscribe button. Also, like this video. And if you want to read more of our stuff and you want to become a member of Reaction, the address is below. And you get Maggie's column, you get my newsletter on politics every Saturday morning, and you get lots of columnists and fascinating stuff from people like Tim Marshall, who writes every week on geopolitics. And you get invites to our events, real live events coming up soon as the world returns. But until next time, thank you for watching and listening.